The territory was a vast, open wound baked hard by the sun. It was a stretch of earth that God seemed to have made in anger and then abandoned to the wind. Nestled somewhere in the unforgiving seam between the New Mexico territory and Arizona. Here, the year 1885 felt less like a date on a calendar and more like a sentence to be served. The sky was a bleached, sickly blue, stretching tight over jagged mesas that cut the horizon like the teeth of an old saw. Dust did not just blow here, it hung suspended in the air, a fine, gritty haze that tasted of copper and ancient, dried bones. Eli Carter rode through this silence with the ease of a man who had long ago stopped expecting the land to be kind. He sat tall in the saddle, his spine a straight line against the slouching horizon. He was driving a string of 6 horses, roans and bays mostly, moving them toward a ranch job near the struggling settlement of Redemption. He wore the dust like a second skin. It coated the brim of his hat, settled in the deep creases around his eyes, and dulled the shine of the Winchester in his saddle scabbard. Eli was a man built of rawhide and silence. He had been a scout once. In years he preferred not to discuss, and that old profession had left him with a habit of watching the ground more than the sky. The earth always told the truth, even when men lied. He saw the buzzards first. They were black specks circling in a lazy, tightening spiral a few miles to the west, near where the old wagon road dipped toward a dried-out riverbed. Buzzards meant death, which was common enough, but the pattern of their flight suggested a feast, not a solitary animal that had succumbed to thirst. Eli reined in his mount, a sturdy sorrel gelding, and signaled the string of horses to a halt with a low whistle. He sat motionless for a long minute, listening. The wind hissed through the dry scrub brush. A cicada buzzed, a sound like a rattlesnake's warning. Underneath it all, there was a stillness that felt heavy, the kind of vacuum that follows a gunshot. He turned the sorrel off the trail, moving slowly toward the circling birds. As he crested a low rise, the smell hit him, the copper tang of blood and the sweet, cloying scent of death accelerated by the desert heat. Below him, in the shadow of a cut bank, lay the wreckage of an ambush. It had been a wagon once, but now it was a skeleton of charred wood and twisted iron. The canvas cover had burned away, leaving the ribs of the frame reaching up like fingers. Around it, the ground was churned up, scarred by hoofprints that wove a chaotic story of panic and pursuit. Eli rode closer, his hand drifting instinctively to the grip of his revolver. There were 3 bodies scattered in the dirt. They were already stiffening, their limbs angled unnaturally. Eli looked down at them with a cold, professional detachment. They were not travelers. They were hard men. One lay face down, the back of his canvas duster dark with blood. When Eli nudged the body over with the toe of his boot, the sun glinted off a tin star pinned to the man's vest, a deputy's badge. 10 feet away lay another man, this one wearing a rough cotton shirt emblazoned with a brand, a stylized H inside a circle, the brand of Clayton Harlow, the cattle baron who treated this valley like his personal kingdom. It was a mess. Lawmen and ranch hands dead in the same dirt, mismatched gear scattered, spent brass casings winking in the sunlight. It looked like a double cross, or a slaughter where the lines of allegiance had blurred until only the dying remained. Eli was about to turn his horse, intending to leave the dead to their business. When he heard it, it was a small sound, hardly more than a catch of breath, coming from the cluster of mesquite and tumbled rocks near the edge of the dry riverbed. He froze. His horse pinned its ears back. Eli dismounted slowly, keeping the animal between him and the rocks. He drew his Colt, the motion fluid and practiced. "Is anyone there?" he called out. His voice was rough from the dust, scratching against the silence. There was no answer, only the sound of rocks shifting. Eli moved forward, boots crunching softly on the gravel. He circled the brush, gun raised. "Don't come any closer." The voice was female, hoarse and trembling, but holding a jagged edge of steel. Eli stopped. He peered into the shadows beneath the overhang of the bank. A woman was wedged into a crevice between 2 boulders, half hidden by a screen of dry brush. She was curled tight, one hand clutching her side, the fabric of her shirt soaked dark and wet. In her other hand, she held a small revolver. The barrel wavered, shaking violently, but the dark eye of the muzzle was pointed at his chest. She looked like something the desert had chewed up and spat out. Her hair, thick and dark, had come loose from its braid and hung in matted tangles around a face that was streaked with soot and dried blood. She was striking, even in this state. High cheekbones that spoke of her father's people. Eyes the color of dark coffee that burned with fever and fear. This was Rosa Valdez. Eli recognized her description from the wanted posters he had seen nailed to the boardwalks in Silver City and Lordsburg. "Easy now," Eli said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a low rumble meant to soothe spooked horses. "I am not going to hurt you. You are a liar," she spat back. Her finger tightened on the trigger. "You are here for the bounty, just like the rest of them." Eli looked at the gun in her hand. It was a cheap thing, likely to miss fire. But at this range, it would still kill him. He looked at her face. He saw the exhaustion pulling at her skin, the way her lips were cracked and white. She was terrified, cornered, and running on nothing but adrenaline. He slowly moved his hand to his belt. With deliberate slowness, he took his revolver by the barrel and slid it back into his holster. He held his empty hands up, palms open. "I am not a bounty hunter," he said. "I am just a man driving horses. You are bleeding, miss. I know I am bleeding," she snapped, though her voice hitched with pain. "You shouldn't help me. You hear me, cowboy? You shouldn't help me. They will hang you right alongside me." She said it with a conviction that chilled him. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. She was warning him, even in her desperation, with death hovering over her. She was trying to push him away to save his skin. Eli looked at her, really looked at her, and the years seemed to fold back. He saw a flash of another face, softer, smiling, standing on a porch in a dress of blue calico. A woman he had promised to keep safe. A woman who had died because he had been too slow, too careful, or perhaps just not enough. That old failure lived in his chest like a lead weight, heavy and cold. He had walked away from trouble 1,000 times since then, telling himself it was wisdom. But looking at Rosa Valdez, seeing the fire in her eyes dimming as the blood seeped between her fingers, he knew he could not ride away. Not this time. "The hell with hanging," Eli muttered. He stepped forward. "I told you to stay back," she gasped, trying to lift the gun higher. Eli ignored the weapon. He closed the distance in 2 long strides. Before she could decide whether to shoot him, he reached out and gently took the revolver from her failing grip. Her hand was ice cold. He tucked her gun into his belt and knelt beside her. "Let me see," he said. She tried to shove him away, but she had no strength left. Her head lolled back against the rock. "Why?" she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "Why are you doing this?" Eli didn't answer. He carefully peeled back the edge of her vest. The bullet had grazed her ribs, a deep, ugly furrow that had bled freely but hadn't pierced the lung. It was bad, but not fatal. Not if he got it clean. He stood up and looked down at her. She was watching him with a mixture of confusion and waiting terror. "My name is Eli," he said. "I'm going to put you on my horse. It is going to hurt. I can walk," she said, trying to push herself up. She made it 2 inches before a gasp of agony tore from her throat and she collapsed back into the dust. Eli shook his head. "No, you can't." He bent down, sliding one arm behind her knees and the other behind her back. He lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, her frame wiry and thin under the layers of trail clothes. She groaned, a low, guttural sound, and her head fell against his shoulder. He carried her to the sorrel. The horse sidestepped nervously, smelling the blood. But Eli murmured a sharp command and the animal held still. Lifting her into the saddle was a struggle. She had no strength to help him. He managed to get her seated, her body slumping forward over the saddle horn. Eli swung up behind her. There was no room for modesty. He had to wrap his arms around her waist to keep her from falling. He took the reins, feeling the heat of her fever burning through the back of her shirt against his chest. "Hold on," he said. "We have to go," she mumbled, her words slurring. "They will come back. The marshal." "He will come back to check." "I know," Eli said. He turned the horse away from the wagon road, guiding the string of loose horses with a whistle. They headed not toward redemption, but toward the broken, rocky hills to the north. The ride was a blur of heat and rhythmic pain. For the first hour, Rosa tried to hold herself upright, her pride acting as a steel rod in her spine. She refused to lean back against him, clutching the saddle horn until her knuckles were white. But as the sun climbed higher and the heat hammered down on the valley, her resistance crumbled. She sagged backward. Her head came to rest in the hollow of Eli's shoulder. He could feel the shallow rapidity of her breathing. Every time the horse navigated a drop in the trail or stepped over a rock, a tremor of pain shuddered through her body and transferred directly into his. It was an intimacy he hadn't prepared for. He could smell her, dust, sage, gun smoke, and the subtle, underlying scent of woman. To keep her conscious, he asked her questions. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice close to her ear. "Men," she murmured. "Harlow's men, and the law. Same thing. They say you raided the town." Eli said, "3 years back. The fire. I didn't," she said, her voice rising with a sudden, feverish energy. "I was there, but I didn't light it. I tried to stop them. My father, he was a hard man, but he wasn't a butcher. They lied, all of them." She drifted into silence for a while, then spoke again, her voice barely audible over the crunch of hooves on stone. "My mother was white," she said, as if explaining a crime, "a rancher's daughter. My father was a vaquero. I am nothing, just a half-breed to them, a traitor to both sides." Eli tightened his arm around her waist as she swayed dangerously. He knew the type of hate she spoke of. It was the kind that didn't need a reason, only a target. "Save your breath," Eli said. "We are almost there." They rode until the shadows stretched long and purple across the valley floor. The terrain grew rougher, the trail narrowing as it wound up into a canyon choked with piñon pine and juniper. The wind began to pick up, carrying a sharp bite that signaled a change in the weather. Eli's line cabin sat in a rocky draw, invisible until you were right on top of it. It was a squatter's shack he had patched up 2 winters ago, built of rough-hewn logs and mud, backed up against a sheer cliff face that protected it from the worst of the northerly winds. There was a small corral for the horses and a rusted stovepipe jutting from the roof. He halted the horse in front of the door. "We are here," he said. Rosa didn't answer. She had passed out. Eli dismounted carefully, sliding out from behind her while keeping a hand on her arm to keep her steady. He reached up and pulled her down into his arms. She was dead weight now. He kicked the door open. The cabin smelled of stale air and wood smoke. It was a single room, sparse and masculine. A narrow bunk shoved against one wall. A table made of crate wood. A stone hearth. He laid her on the bunk. The wool blanket was rough, gray, and dusty. Eli didn't waste time. He lit the kerosene lamp on the table, the flame sputtering before settling into a steady yellow glow. He built a fire in the hearth, feeding it kindling until the flames caught. Then he went to his saddlebags and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and a small tin box containing a needle and thread. He pulled a chair to the side of the bed. Rosa was stirring, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around the dim room, panic flaring for a second until her gaze landed on him. "You brought me to a shack," she whispered. "It is a palace compared to that riverbed," Eli said. "Drink this." He held the bottle to her lips. She took a swallow, coughed, and grimaced as the liquor burned her throat. "I need to clean that wound," Eli said. "I'm going to have to cut your shirt." Rosa looked at him. Her eyes were dark, unreadable pools in the lamplight. She didn't argue. She nodded once, a small, jerky motion. Eli worked with quiet efficiency. He used his knife to slice the fabric of her shirt, peeling it away from her skin. The wound was angry and red, clotted with dirt and dried blood. He poured whiskey onto a rag. "This will burn," he warned. He pressed the cloth to her side. Rosa hissed, her back arching off the mattress. Her hand shot out and gripped Eli's forearm, her fingernails digging into his skin. She didn't scream, but her breath came in short, sharp gasps. Eli didn't look at her face. He kept his eyes focused on the wound, his hands steady despite the tremor in her body. He felt a profound sense of intrusion. He was touching her skin, seeing the curve of her ribs, the pale softness of her stomach that had been hidden from the sun. He respected her by not looking where he shouldn't, keeping his gaze clinical. But he was a man, and she was a woman, and the air in the small cabin felt suddenly thick. He threaded the needle. "Hold still," he said softly. He began to stitch. Every time the needle pierced her skin, he felt her flinch. She watched him, her eyes wide, tracking the movement of his hands. She saw the way he bit his lip in concentration, the gentleness that seemed at odds with his calloused, gunfighter hands. "Why?" she asked again, her voice a thread. Eli tied off the last stitch and snipped the thread. He bandaged her side with clean strips of cloth. "Because I was heading this way," he said, deflecting. He pulled the blanket up to her chin, covering her. "Rest," he said. He stood up and walked to the other side of the room, putting distance between them. He busied himself with the fire, staring into the flames. He could feel her eyes on his back. As night fully descended, the weather turned. The wind that had been nagging at them all afternoon transformed into a full-blown gale, screaming down from the mountains. It slammed against the cabin walls, rattling the door on its leather hinges. The temperature plummeted. It was the kind of sudden freeze common to the high desert, where the heat of the day vanished into the thin air, leaving behind a bone-deep cold. The fire hissed in the hearth, but it wasn't enough. The drafts cut through the chinking in the logs. Eli sat in the chair, wrapped in his duster, watching Rosa. She was shivering. It started as a small trembling in her shoulders and quickly took over her whole body. Her teeth chattered, a sharp clicking sound in the quiet room. She was losing heat. The blood loss and the shock had left her defenseless against the cold. Eli watched her for a long time. He knew what he had to do. It was a matter of survival, a necessity of the frontier. But it felt like crossing a line more dangerous than the one he had crossed by picking her up. He stood up and walked to the bed. "You are freezing," he said. I am fine," she stammered. Her jaw clenched tight. "You are not," Eli said. "Move over." He didn't wait for her permission. He sat on the edge of the narrow bunk and pulled off his boots. He unbuckled his gun belt and hung it on the bedpost. Then he lay down beside her. The bed was too small for two people to lie apart. They had to fit together. Rosa stiffened as he lay down. He could feel the tension radiating off her, hard and brittle. "Turn on your side," he instructed gently. "Face the wall." She hesitated, then turned slowly, favoring her wounded side. Eli turned as well, lying behind her. He pulled the heavy wool blanket up over both of them, tucking it in tight around her shoulders. He lay stiffly at first, keeping a respectful inch of space between them, but the cold was relentless. Rosa's shivering was violent now, shaking the bed frame. Eli sighed, a sound of resignation. "Come here," he whispered. He closed the gap. He pressed his chest against her back, wrapping one heavy arm around her waist, careful to avoid her wound. He pulled her flush against him, sharing his body heat. He felt her freeze, her breath hitching in her throat. For a long moment, she held herself rigid, a statue of resistance. But slowly, the warmth of his body began to seep into hers. The shivering began to subside. She relaxed, inch by inch. Her head fell back, resting near his shoulder. They lay there in the dark, the wind howling like a banshee outside the thin walls. Eli could feel the beat of her heart against his arm. It was fast, fluttering like a trapped bird. He could smell the scent of her hair. No longer just dust, but something sweeter, something human. He was acutely aware of the curve of her hip, the line of her spine, the softness of her breathing. He knew he should be thinking about the posse that would be tracking them, or the water supply, or the danger he was in. But all he could think about was the woman in his arms. He wanted to pull her tighter. He wanted to smooth the hair back from her forehead. He did neither. He lay still, his hand resting chastely on her waist, his jaw set in the darkness. Rosa lay with her eyes open, staring at the rough logs of the wall. She felt the strength of the man behind her, the solid, undeniable weight of him. She had spent her life running, fighting, pushing people away before they could hurt her. But here, in the dark, with the cold trying to kill her, she let herself be held. She felt a strange, terrifying pull in her chest. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a longing she thought she had strangled years ago. She closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered into the dark. Eli didn't answer right away. He just tightened his hold on her, a fraction of an inch. "Go to sleep, Rosa," he said softly. Outside, the wind scoured the land, erasing their tracks, leaving them alone at the edge of the world. Inside, the silence was heavy with things unsaid, with old wounds aching and new fires waiting to be lit. Dawn broke over the high desert not with warmth, but with a pale, bruised light that seeped through the cracks in the cabin logs. The wind had died down sometime in the gray hours, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt heavy on the ears. In the narrow bunk, the world was small and warm. Rosa woke slowly, drifting up from a depth of exhaustion she had not felt in years. For a moment, she did not know where she was. She only knew that the cold was gone. There was a steady, rhythmic thrumming against her back, a sound like a large, slow drum. She shifted, her legs heavy and tangled with something solid and rough-clad. She opened her eyes. The rough-hewn timber of the wall was inches from her nose. The smell of wood smoke, old wool, and man filled her lungs. Memory returned with the force of a physical blow. The ambush, the blood, the cowboy. Rosa stiffened. She realized with a jolt of panic that she was backed against Eli Carter's chest, her head resting in the crook of his arm. His breath, slow and deep with sleep, stirred the loose hair at the nape of her neck. His arm was draped over her waist, heavy and possessive, his hand resting flat against her stomach, just above the bandage on her ribs. It was an intimacy she had not known, not ever. She had grown up watching her parents, the way her mother would lean into her father's shoulder. But for Rosa, touch had always been a thing of violence or rejection. To wake up entangled with a man, to feel the heat of him seeping into her own cold bones, felt dangerous. It felt like a trap. She gasped, a sharp intake of air, and scrambled away. She shoved at his arm, ignoring the bite of pain in her side, and rolled toward the edge of the mattress. Eli was awake instantly. There was no transition from sleep to wakefulness, only a sudden stillness in his breathing. He didn't grab for her. He simply withdrew his arm, pulling it back as if he had touched a hot stove. Rosa sat on the edge of the bunk, her back to him, clutching the blanket to her chest. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I am sorry," she said, her voice brittle. "I did not mean to fall asleep." Eli sat up slowly behind her. The mattress creaked. "You were freezing," he said. His voice was rough with sleep, a low rumble that vibrated in the small room. "We did what we had to do to keep the cold out." Rosa refused to look at him. She felt a flush rising on her neck, hot and shameful. It wasn't just the modesty of it, it was the betrayal of her own body, which had sought out his warmth and settled into it as if it belonged there. "I'm fine now," she said, standing up on shaky legs. Eli didn't argue. He swung his legs out of the bed and stood up. He moved to the door, pulling his duster on over his shirt. He jammed his hat onto his head, pulling the brim low. "I will see to the horses," he said. He stepped out into the piercing morning, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Outside, the air was sharp enough to cut glass. Frost crusted the dry grass in the draw, turning the brown stalks into delicate, silver sculptures. The sky was a washed-out blue, vast and indifferent. Eli took a deep breath, letting the icy air scour his lungs. He needed the cold. He needed it to chase away the lingering warmth of her skin that seemed to cling to his shirt, to his hands, to his mind. He walked to the corral, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen ground. The horses watched him with steam billowing from their nostrils. He checked the sorrel, running a hand down its flank. But his mind was back in the cabin. He was a fool. He knew it. He had spent 10 years keeping his life simple, keeping his head down, and in the span of 24 hours, he had invited a storm into his house. He looked at his hands. He could still feel the curve of her waist, the fragile bird bones of her rib cage under the rough fabric. He fed the horses, moving through the chores with mechanical precision. He needed distance. He needed to remember why he was alive and why the woman in his cabin was walking death. He went back to the door but didn't go in. "I am riding out," he called through the wood. "To the windmill! We need water." There was a pause. Then her voice, muffled and small. "Be careful." Eli mounted the sorrel and turned it toward the ridge. The ride to the nearest windmill took him 2 hours. It was part of the Double Bar Ranch, a sprawling operation that bordered the Badlands. The windmill stood like a lonely sentinel on a rise, the metal blades groaning as they turned in the wind, pumping water into a wide wooden trough. Eli approached cautiously. He kept the sorrel at a walk, scanning the horizon. There were 2 horses tied to the rail, cow ponies with brands on their hips. He rode up. 2 men were leaning against the trough, rolling cigarettes. Eli knew the type. Drifters, hired hands who worked for $30 a month and drifted with the seasons. "Morning," Eli said, nodding as he dismounted. One of the men, a redhead with a face full of freckles and a battered hat, looked up. He squinted at Eli. "Morning," the redhead said. "Mind if I water my horse?" Eli asked. "Water is free." The second man said. He was older, with a gray beard and eyes that looked like they had seen too much sun. "Unless you are asking for whiskey. That costs extra." Eli chuckled dryly and let the sorrel drink. He busied himself checking his cinch, keeping his head down. "Quiet out this way," Eli offered. "Quiet enough," the redhead said, striking a match on his boot heel. "Except for the trouble down south." "You hear about the ambush?" Eli paused. "Heard something. Bloody mess," the older man spat. "Deputy and 2 of Harlow's boys, dead in the dirt. They say it was the Valdez girl." Eli felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He kept his face neutral, patting the horse's neck. "A girl did that?" Eli asked. "She is not a girl," the redhead said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "She is a she-wolf, daughter of that old bandit Juan Valdez. They say she led them into a trap, just like she did 3 years ago at the livery." The older man shook his head, looking down at the water. "Bad business. That," he muttered. "I was there, saw the smoke, saw them pull the bodies out. 3 kids died in that fire, burned in their beds while the Valdez gang robbed the bank." The redhead nodded. "Harlow has put $500 on her head, dead or alive. Says he wants justice for the little ones. Marshall says she is hurt, though, says they winged her. Can't have gone far." Eli felt the blood drain from his face, though he kept his expression stony. $500 was a fortune. It was enough to buy a small ranch. It was enough to make every desperate man in the territory a hunter. But it was the other part that chilled him. The children. He tightened the cinch, the leather creaking in his grip. $500, Eli repeated. "That is a lot of money. Enough to make a man look twice at every shadow," the older man said, eyeing Eli. "You seen anything?" Eli swung into the saddle. He looked at the 2 men. They were hard, simple men, fed on rumors and fear. They believed what they were told. "Just dust and buzzards," Eli said. He tipped his hat and turned the sorrel back toward the hills, keeping his pace slow until he was out of sight. Then he spurred the horse into a gallop. When he returned to the cabin, the sun was high and the wind had picked up, driving dust against the logs. He burst through the door, bringing a gust of grit with him. Rosa was sitting by the hearth, stoking the fire. She looked up, startled by his entrance. She had cleaned herself up as best she could. She had braided her hair and washed the blood from her hands, though her face was still pale and drawn. "You are back," she said. Eli slammed the door shut and dropped the bar in place. He stood there, breathing hard, the dust on his coat smelling of the ride. He looked at her, really looked at her, searching for the monster the men had described. He saw only a wounded woman with eyes too big for her face, I heard talk, Eli said. His voice was flat, devoid of the gentleness he had used the night before. Rosa went still. She put the poker down, her hand trembling slightly. "What talk?" she asked. Eli walked to the table and poured himself a cup of water from the bucket. But he didn't drink. He gripped the tin cup until his knuckles turned white. "I met two hands at the windmill," Eli said. "They say there is $500 on your head. Clayton Harlow is paying it." Rosa looked down at her hands. "I told you I was wanted. They said something else," Eli continued, his voice hardening. "They said you killed children." The silence that followed was absolute. The fire popped, a loud crack in the small room. Rosa's head snapped up. Her eyes were blazing, wet and furious. "Is that what they say?" she whispered. "They say you were there 3 years ago." Eli said, "At the livery fire. They say you rode with the raiders who burned it down to cover a bank robbery. They say 3 children died in the smoke. I was there," Rosa said. Eli felt something break inside him. He had wanted her to deny it. He had wanted her to say it was a lie, that she had been miles away. "You were there," he repeated, his voice hollow. "Yes," she cried, standing up. The movement cost her. She grabbed her side with a gasp, but she didn't stop. She faced him, swaying slightly, her face twisted with a mixture of rage and grief. "I was there. My father made me go. He said I had to learn the trade. He said we were just going to scare the horses, make a distraction so they could take the bank. But it went wrong." She took a step toward him, her hands balled into fists. "Harlow's men were waiting. She said it was a setup. My father's men panicked." "Someone threw a lantern. The hay went up like powder. I saw the fire start. I tried to run in. I tried to open the stall doors. I tried to get to the back room where the family slept." Tears spilled over her lashes, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "My father grabbed my reins," Rosa said, her voice cracking. "He dragged me away. He said it was done. He said war has casualties." She looked at Eli, pleading with him to believe her. "Harlow used that fire," she said. "He owned the bank. He had the money moved the day before. He let the town burn so he could buy the ashes cheap. He needed a villain. Eli, he needed a monster to scare the people so they would look to him for protection. Who better than the half-breed daughter of a Mexican bandit?" She sank back onto the stool, her energy spent. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly. "The marshal wrote the story," she whispered, "and the town believed it. Because it was easier to hate me than to look at the man who owns them." Eli watched her. He saw the way her shoulders shook. He heard the raw ring of truth in her voice. It was a messy, ugly truth, the kind that didn't fit into a simple song. He walked over to the hearth. He stood looking down at her for a long moment. Then, he reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a heavy, grounding weight. "They called you a she-wolf," Eli said softly. Rosa laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "They have called me worse since I was 5 years old," she said. "Too brown for the white school, too white for the Mexican families. I was never Rosa. I was always the mistake, the Valdez girl. When the fire happened, it just confirmed what they always whispered, that I had bad blood, that I was born wrong." Eli squeezed her shoulder. "Blood does not make you a killer," he said. "Choices do." He turned away and began to unbuckle his spurs. "We are in for a storm," he said, changing the subject. "The sky is turning green over the mesas." The storm hit an hour later, and it was a fury. It was not rain, but dust and wind. A haboob rolling up from the south, a wall of earth that blotted out the sun. The cabin was plunged into a twilight gloom. The wind battered the logs, searching for weaknesses, whistling through the chinking like a choir of ghosts. They were trapped. For 2 days, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the cabin, the fire, and the two of them. The confinement forced a domesticity on them that felt strange and fragile. They fell into a rhythm. Eli chopped wood from the stack in the corner, keeping the fire fed. He checked the window shutters, stuffing rags into the gaps to keep the dust out. Rosa, despite her injury, refused to sit idle. She took over the cooking, stirring a pot of beans and salt pork over the fire, her movements slow and careful. The mundane tasks took on a weight they shouldn't have had. When Eli handed her a ladle, their fingers brushed, and the contact lingered in the air like static electricity. When Rosa sat to rest, watching him oil his rifle, the silence between them was not empty, but full of unasked questions. On the second evening, the wind was still howling, rattling the door in its frame. The lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. They had eaten in silence, the plates scraped clean. Eli sat by the fire, whittling a piece of pine. Rosa was mending a tear in his spare shirt, her needle flashing in the firelight. "You handle a gun well," Rosa said, breaking the silence. "For a horse wrangler." Eli didn't look up. His knife peeled a long curl of wood. "I wasn't always a wrangler," he said. "What were you?" she asked. Eli paused. He looked at the fire, his eyes distant. "I was a scout," he said, "during the war, and after—" He stopped whittling. He turned the piece of wood over in his hands. "I led a wagon train once," he said, 10 years ago. "Up near the Salt River. Good people. Families. I had scouted the trail a dozen times. I thought it was safe." Rosa stopped sewing. She watched him, sensing the opening of an old wound. "I was wrong," Eli said. His voice was low, devoid of emotion, which made it all the more terrible. "There was a war party moving south. We rode right into them." He looked at his hands. "My fiancée was on that train," he said. "Her name was Clara. She had a laugh that could make you forget it was raining." Rosa felt a pang in her chest, a sharp ache of sympathy. "Eli," she whispered. "I tried to get to her wagon." Eli said, "I fought my way through, but I was too late. I watched them take her. I watched the wagon burn." He looked up at Rosa, his gray eyes stark and haunted. "I chose the trail," he said. "I led them there. Everyone said it was bad luck, said it was war, but I knew it was my job to know, and I failed." Rosa put the shirt down. She moved from the chair to the hearth rug, sitting near his feet. She reached out and covered his hand with hers. Her skin was rough, calloused from the rains, but her touch was gentle. "You carried that for 10 years. She said, "Every mile." Eli said, "That is why I helped you. Rosa, I saw you in that riverbed, and I saw her. I couldn't leave another woman to the buzzards." Rosa looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She saw the lines of pain etched around his mouth, the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders. It was a mirror of her own burden. He was blamed by his own conscience. She was blamed by a town. Both of them were walking through life looking backward at the smoke. "You are not him," Rosa said fiercely. "You are not the man who failed. You are the man who stopped." Eli looked at her hand on his. He turned his palm over, interlacing his fingers with hers. The fit was startlingly perfect. "I don't know who I am anymore," Eli admitted. The wind outside gusted, a violent shriek that shook the roof. The door rattled in its frame. Suddenly, a draft caught the lamp flame. It flickered wildly, gasped, and died. The cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the deep orange glow of the dying coals in the hearth. Neither of them moved. The darkness changed things. It stripped away the hesitation. Eli could hear her breathing, just inches away. He could feel the warmth of her hand in his. The air in the cabin felt suddenly thin, charged with the storm outside and the storm inside. "Rosa," Eli said, his voice a warning. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't tell me to stop." She leaned forward. He could sense her movement in the dark. "I am tired of being alone." "Eli," she said, her voice trembling. "I am tired of being afraid." She moved closer. Her hand released his and traveled up his arm, finding his shoulder, then the side of his neck. Her fingers were cool, her touch tentative. Eli froze. Every instinct he had screamed at him to pull away, to remember the danger, to remember Clara. But the scent of her was filling his head, and the loneliness of 10 years was a vast, empty canyon that wanted to be filled. Rosa leaned in. She pressed her lips to his. It was a hesitant kiss, born of desperation and the sheer human need for contact. Her lips were dry, chapped from the wind, and she tasted of salt and sorrow. For a heartbeat. Eli sat rigid. Then, with a low groan that seemed to be torn from his chest, he brought his hand up to the back of her head, tangling his fingers in her thick braid. He pulled her closer, deepening the kiss. It wasn't gentle. It was urgent. It was a collision of two broken people trying to find a whole piece between them. Rosa made a small sound in her throat and pressed herself against him, careful of her ribs but desperate for his solidity. The kiss grew heated, a frantic exploration. Eli's other hand found her waist, pulling her onto his lap. For a moment, the world outside didn't exist. There was no posse, no fire, no dead fiancé. There was only the firelight on her skin and the taste of her mouth. Then, as quickly as it had begun, Rosa pulled back. She scrambled off his lap, retreating into the shadows near the bunk. Her breathing was ragged, loud in the quiet room. "I can't," she gasped. Eli stayed by the fire, his hands still raised in the air where she had been. He took a steadying breath, trying to slow the hammering of his heart. "Rosa," he said. "No," she said, her voice sharp with panic. "This is wrong. You don't know what you are doing." "I think I do," Eli said. "You don't," she snapped. "Everyone who loves me ends up dead. Eli, my father, my mother, the men who rode with us. I am cursed. I am poison. If you touch me, you will burn. Just like that livery." She was hugging herself again, retreating behind the wall of her fear. Eli stood up slowly. He didn't move toward her. He respected the distance she needed. "I have been burned before," Eli said quietly. "I am still standing. You are foolish," she whispered. "Maybe," Eli said. He walked to the window and adjusted the rag in the chinking, blocking a draft. He kept his back to her. "Get some sleep, Rosa. The storm will break by morning." "We can't stay here," she said, her voice regaining some of its steel. "I know," Eli said, but the air in the room had changed. The line had been crossed. They weren't just two strangers hiding from the law anymore. They were two people who had tasted the possibility of something else. And the fear of that possibility was more terrifying than any marshal with a gun. Eli stared out into the dark, listening to the wind die down, knowing that the real storm was just beginning. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world scoured and raw. When Eli opened the cabin door, the light that spilled over the threshold was hard and brittle, lacking any warmth. The heavy rains had washed the dust from the air, leaving the atmosphere so clear that the distant mesas looked like they had been cut from tin and pasted against the horizon. The hills, usually a dull, dusty brown, gleamed with wet slickness, and the draw below the cabin was a quagmire of thick, clay-colored mud. Eli stood in the doorway, drinking coffee from a tin cup, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. The silence was absolute, save for the drip of water from the eaves. It was a deceptive peace. The rain would have washed away their tracks leading to the cabin, which bought them time. But the mud would make leaving difficult. Yet, staying was not an option. The storm had pinned the posses down too. But now that the sky had cleared, men would be in the saddle again. A stationary target in this country was a dead target. He turned back into the room. Rosa was sitting on the edge of the bunk, pulling on her boots. She moved stiffly, favoring her left side where the bullet had grazed her. But the fever had broken. Her eyes were clear, dark and focused, though shadowed by the same worry that gnawed at Eli's gut. "We cannot stay here," Eli said, tossing the dregs of his coffee into the fire. "I know," Rosa replied. She stood up, testing her balance. "The marshal will check the high country lines eventually, and Harlow has men who know these hills almost as well as you do." Eli began to pack. He moved with the economy of a man who had lived out of saddlebags for half his life. He rolled the spare blanket, checked the level of the kerosene, and then let the fire die down. "We need a direction," Eli said. "We can head north, try for the Colorado line, or west, into the territories where the law is thinner." Rosa shook her head. "Running is not enough." "Eli," If we run, we are just waiting to be caught. We will be looking over our shoulders until we are old, or until a bullet finds us." She walked over to the table where he was sorting ammunition. She placed her hand on his wrist, stopping him. "There is another way," she said. Eli looked at her. Her hand was warm, her grip firm. "What way?" he asked. "My father," she said, her voice steady. "He was a bandit, yes, but he was a businessman in his own way. He did not trust anyone, especially not the men who hired him. He kept records." "Records?" Eli repeated. "A ledger," Rosa said, "a black book, and letters. He kept every letter Clayton Harlow ever sent him, instructions on which herds to raid, which water rights to sabotage, and the plan for the bank robbery and redemption. Harlow paid for the kerosene that burned the livery. It is all written down." Eli felt a jolt of shock. If such a thing existed, it wasn't just proof. It was a weapon. It was a noose for Clayton Harlow's neck. "Where is it?" Eli asked. "There is a hideout," Rosa said. "An old adobe compound on the other side of the painted desert, near the salt flats. My father used it as a cache. He buried the box under the floorboards of the main room. He told me if anything ever happened to him, that box was my insurance." Eli looked at her, weighing the words. The painted desert was a crucible. It was miles of waterless badlands, broken rock, and heat that could kill a horse in an afternoon. To cross it with a wounded woman and a single horse was madness. But the alternative was a slow flight to nowhere, pursued by a lie that would never die. "It is a hard ride," Eli said. "Maybe 3 days hard riding, and the water holes will be scarce." "I can make it," Rosa said. Eli studied her face. He saw the fear there, buried deep, but he also saw a resolve that matched his own. She was tired of running. She wanted to fight. "Pack the food," Eli said, turning back to his gear. "Take everything we can carry." They spent the next hour preparing. Eli chose the sturdy sorrel gelding, the strongest of the string, and turned the others loose to scatter into the canyons. He couldn't risk leading a string. It would slow them down and leave a trail a blind man could follow. They would have to ride double, or walk and ride in turns. He packed a sack with dried beans, coffee, and the last of the jerked beef. He filled 2 canteens from the rain barrel and tied a canvas tarp behind the saddle. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. When they rode out, the sun was climbing, turning the mud into a sticky, sucking trap. The air remained cold, a biting chill that cut through their coats. But the light was blinding. The landscape they entered was a testament to the violence of geology. It was a wide, broken valley of thorny mesquite and scattered yucca, where the earth had been twisted and buckled by ancient fires. Distant buttes glowed blood-red in the sun, standing like ruined cathedrals against the pale sky. High above, black vultures circled on the thermals, patient and silent witnesses to the emptiness. For the first few hours, they did not speak. Eli sat in the saddle, and Rosa rode behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist. He could feel the tension in her body, the way she flinched when the horse slipped in the mud. He tried to keep the pace steady, guiding the sorrel along the rocky spines of the ridges to avoid leaving deep tracks in the soft bottoms. The emptiness of the land was absolute. There were no fences, no cattle, no sign of man. It felt threatening, a vast indifference that could swallow them whole without a burp. Yet, there was a strange freedom in it too. Out here, under the open sky, the laws of redemption and the greed of Clayton Harlow felt small, like distant thunder that couldn't reach them. By midday, they stopped to rest the horse near a lone cottonwood tree that had managed to find water in a deep fissure of rock. The shade was sparse, a lace pattern of bare branches against the glare, but it was a relief from the sun which, despite the cold air, burned with a high-altitude intensity. Eli built a small fire of twigs to boil coffee. They sat on a flat rock, sharing the tin cup, passing it back and forth. The steam rose into the dry air. "You ride well for a man who complains about his knees," Rosa said, taking a sip and handing the cup back to him. Eli chuckled. "A dry sound. My knees are fine. It is my patience that is wearing thin. This horse has a gait like a rock slide." "He is a good horse," Rosa said, patting the sorrel's neck. "He is carrying 2 souls and a week of beans. You should be grateful." "I am grateful," Eli said, looking at her over the rim of the cup. "I am grateful he hasn't thrown us both into a cactus." Rosa smiled. It was a small thing, fleeting, but it transformed her face. For a second, the haunted look vanished, replaced by a glimpse of the woman she might have been if the world hadn't decided she was an enemy. Eli watched her as she turned to scan the horizon. Her eyes moved constantly, checking the skyline, the shadows of the rocks, the movement of the birds. She was like a deer at a water hole, always waiting for the snap of a twig. It broke his heart a little to see it, the way she could never fully relax, the way safety was a concept she didn't understand. "What are you looking for?" Eli asked softly. "Dust," she said without turning. "Crows rising. Anything that moves. There is nothing out here. Rosa, just us and the lizards." She turned back to him, her expression serious. "That is when they come, Eli. When you think there is nothing." He reached out and took the cup from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was electric, a sudden spark that made the air between them hum. He held her gaze. "I am watching too," he said. "You don't have to do it all alone." Rosa looked at him, her lips parting slightly. She didn't pull her hand away. "I am not used to that," she whispered. "Get used to it," Eli said. They rode on as the afternoon wore away into a bruised purple twilight. The temperature dropped sharply as the sun dipped below the mesas. The cold in this country was a physical weight. It pressed down on the shoulders and seeped through leather and wool. They made camp in a shallow cave located halfway up the side of a sandstone cliff. It wasn't much of a cave, just a scoop out of the rock face, protected by an overhang, but the ceiling was streaked with soot from fires that had burned 50 or 100 years ago. Apache, maybe, or Comancheros. It was a place where men had hidden before. Eli unsaddled the horse and hobbled him in a patch of dry grass nearby. When he climbed back up to the cave, Rosa was sitting with her back against the stone, her arms wrapped tight around her knees. Her teeth were chattering. The cold had returned with a vengeance. The air was still and bitter, freezing the moisture in the ground. Eli cursed under his breath. He gathered what dry brush he could find, mostly dead sage and tumbleweed, and built a small fire near the mouth of the cave. It flared up hot and fast, but he knew it wouldn't last long, and they couldn't risk a large blaze that could be seen for miles in the dark. He spread the canvas tarp on the sandy floor and laid the single wool blanket over it. "Rosa," he said, "come over here." She looked up at him, her face pale in the firelight. Her lips were blue. I am fine," she stammered, the lie shivering out of her. "You are freezing to death," Eli said roughly. "Get under the blanket." She crawled onto the canvas, lying down on her side. She pulled the blanket up, curling into a tight ball. Eli fed the last of the sage to the fire, then sat down on the edge of the tarp. He looked at the shivering mound beneath the wool. The fire was already dying down to coals. The night was going to be long and brutal. He took off his gun belt and set it within easy reach. Then he lay down beside her. He lifted the edge of the blanket and slid underneath. The space was cramped. He had to press his body against hers, spooning her from behind as he had in the cabin. But this time the necessity felt different. It felt inevitable. Rosa gasped as his body made contact with hers. He was warm, a furnace against the ice of her skin. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her back until she was flush against him. He could feel the curve of her spine, the sharpness of her hip bone, the tremor that ran through her limbs. "Relax," Eli murmured into her hair. "I have you." They lay in silence for a long time, listening to the wind hiss over the rock face. Slowly, the heat began to build between them. The shivering stopped. In the darkness, senses were heightened. Eli could feel the rise and fall of her chest against his arm. He could feel the beat of her heart, rapid and light, slowing down as the warmth took hold. He breathed in the scent of her, sage, wood smoke, and the salt of her skin. It was a heady, dangerous perfume. Rosa lay with her eyes open, staring at the soot-stained rock. The man behind her was a solid wall of protection. His breath was warm on the back of her neck. His hand, large and calloused, rested gently on her stomach, the thumb rubbing a slow, unconscious circle against the fabric of her shirt. She fought the rush of want that flooded her chest. It was terrifying. Fear, she understood. Fear was a cold knife. But this warmth, this safety, this desire to turn around and bury herself in him, this was a cliff edge. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered into the dark. "Do what?" Eli asked, his voice low and rumbling against her back. "Want something I am allowed to keep." She said, "Everything I touch breaks." "Eli? Or it gets taken away. If I want you, if I let myself want this, the world will come for us." "It always does." Eli paused. His hand stilled on her waist. "The world is already here." "Rosa," he said softly, "it is outside that cave, but in here it is just us." He tightened his arm around her. "We will worry about tomorrow when the sun comes up," he said. "Tonight, you are just a woman who is cold, and I'm the man keeping you warm." His voice was rough, cracking slightly on the last word. It was the sound of a man holding back a flood. The emotional dam inside Rosa, built of 3 years of running and a lifetime of not belonging, finally showed a hairline fracture. She couldn't be just a woman who was cold. She needed to be more. She needed to be alive. She turned in his arms. The movement was sudden. She shifted, wincing slightly as her ribs pulled, and rolled onto her back, then onto her side to face him. Their faces were inches apart in the dying glow of the embers. She could see the rugged terrain of his face, the scar on his chin, the deep lines around his eyes, the gray gaze that looked at her with a hunger he was trying desperately to hide. "Eli," she breathed. She didn't wait for him to speak. She leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't like the kiss in the cabin. That had been an accident, a question. This was an answer. It was desperate and searching, pouring years of loneliness into the contact. Her hands came up to frame his face, her fingers tangling in his rough hair, pulling him closer. Eli froze for a second, stunned by the intensity, and then he broke. He groaned, a low sound of surrender, and his arms came around her, pulling her hard against him. His mouth moved over hers, hot and demanding. He tasted of coffee and tobacco and desire. His hands spanned her back, sliding down to her waist, his touch steady yet trembling at the edges. He was overwhelmed by the ache of her, by the need to protect her and the sudden, fierce need to possess her. "Rosa," he whispered against her lips. "Don't talk," she murmured. "Please, just don't talk." The cave felt too small for the heat that flared between them. The cold air outside was forgotten. There was only the friction of wool and denim, the warmth of skin finding skin. Eli's hands were careful of her wound, gentle in a way that made her throat tight, even as his kisses grew more urgent, trailing down her jaw to the pulse that hammered in her throat. When they chose to go further, it wasn't a decision made with logic. It was an unspoken agreement that tonight, desire would speak louder than fear. Rosa guided his hands, her own exploring the breadth of his shoulders, the muscles of his back. She needed to feel him, to know he was real, to anchor herself to something solid in a world of shifting sand. The details of the night blurred into a haze of sensation. The roughness of the blanket beneath them, the flicker of the dying fire, the rasp of whispered names. It was a clumsy, beautiful collision. There was pain, yes, and the awkwardness of urgency. But underneath it all was a profound sense of coming home. For the first time in her life, Rosa wasn't the outlaw or the half-breed or the mistake. She was just Rosa, and she was held afterward. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was soft. They lay wrapped together beneath a single blanket, limbs tangled. The fire was dead, leaving them in total darkness, but the warmth remained. Outside, in the vast canyon below, a pack of coyotes began to sing, a high, yipping chorus that echoed off the canyon walls. Rosa lay with her head on Eli's chest, listening to the steady, slowing thud of his heart. She felt raw, her skin sensitive, her emotions exposed. But she also felt strangely calm. The worst had happened. She had let someone in, and the world hadn't ended. She traced a scar on his chest with her fingertip. "You are awake," Eli said, his voice a deep rumble beneath her ear. "Yes," she said. "Are you in pain?" "No." She shifted slightly, pressing closer to him. "I am afraid," she admitted quietly. "Of what?" he asked. "That I will wake up and this will be gone, or that I will get you killed." Eli's arm tightened around her. He stared up at the invisible stone ceiling, his eyes adjusting to the dark. He felt a fierce protectiveness rising in his chest, sharper and more dangerous than anything he had felt in 10 years. He had failed Clara. He had let the war and the world take her. He would burn the whole territory down before he let them take Rosa. "You won't get me killed," Eli vowed, his voice steel in the darkness. "And I am not going anywhere. We get that ledger, we clear your name, and then we find a place where the wind doesn't blow so hard." Rosa closed her eyes. She wanted to believe him. For tonight, she let herself. By dawn, the world had changed. The sun rose with a blinding clarity, turning the red rocks to fire. Eli and Rosa moved with a new awareness of each other as they broke camp. It was in the small things, the way Eli's hand lingered on her waist when he helped her mount the horse, the way Rosa caught his eye and offered a small, shy smile that didn't quite reach the rest of her face, the way they shared the last of the coffee, passing the cup like a secret. But the light also brought the danger back into sharp relief. As they rode out of the canyon and back onto the open flats, the vulnerability of their position hit them. They were two specks in a vast, hostile bowl. Rosa rode behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her face pressed against his back. She held him tighter than before. The night in the cave had given her something to lose. Before, survival had been a habit. Now, it was a necessity. She looked at the horizon, her eyes narrowing against the glare. The fear was sharper now, a physical pain. She knew how much she had to lose if their luck ran out in this deadly country, and the thought terrified her more than the hanging rope ever had. Eli felt her grip tighten. He covered her hands with one of his own, giving a reassuring squeeze, but his eyes never left the skyline. He kept his hand near his gun. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. They were riding toward the truth, and the truth was the most dangerous thing in the West. The days that followed were a blur of heat and grit, a slow attrition of the spirit. The land between the high country and the salt flats was a graveyard of good intentions, a place where the earth cracked open in dry washes and the sun hammered down with the weight of a physical blow. Eli Carter and Rosa Valdez rode through this furnace with their heads bowed and their eyes slitted against the glare. The water in the canteens grew light, sloshing with a hollow sound that marked the hours better than any watch. Their lips cracked and bled, the dry air sucking the moisture from their bodies until their skin felt like parchment stretched too tight over bone. The sturdy sorrel gelding, a beast of immense heart, began to droop, his head lowering with every mile, his hooves dragging in the deep sand of the arroyos. They spoke little. Words required spit, and spit was a currency they could not afford to spend. When they did speak, it was in short, raspy bursts, warnings about loose rock, observations about the position of the sun, or quiet murmurs of reassurance that neither of them truly believed. On the fourth day, as the sun began its descent toward the jagged western horizon, the terrain shifted. The rolling scrubland gave way to a chaotic jumble of sandstone outcrops, twisted fingers of rock that rose from the desert floor like the ruins of a giant's castle. "There," Rosa rasped, pointing a shaking finger. Eli squinted through the haze of heat and dust, tucked into the base of a towering rock formation. Half swallowed by the shadow of the cliff, stood the remains of a structure. It was an adobe compound, its walls melted by decades of rain and wind into soft, organic curves that mimicked the land itself. A creeping thorn bush had claimed the south wall, and a dune of red sand had drifted up against the heavy wooden door. "It looks dead," Eli said, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "It has been dead a long time," Rosa replied. They urged the horse forward, the animal smelling the shade and finding a last reserve of strength. They dismounted in the lee of the wall, their legs trembling as they hit the ground. Eli tied the horse to a twisted mesquite root and loosened the cinch, patting the animal's sweaty neck with a dusty hand. "Stay ready," Eli told the horse softly. He drew his revolver, checking the cylinder from habit, and nodded to Rosa. She moved to the door, pushing against the weathered wood. It groaned, the hinges crying out in rust-choked protest, and swung inward, scraping a furrow in the accumulated dirt. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of ancient dust and rodent droppings. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the collapsed sections of the roof, illuminating a scene of abandonment. A table lay on its side, one leg missing. A scatter of playing cards, yellowed and curled with age, lay across the dirt floor like dead leaves. In the corner, an old saddle, leather cracked and split, sat gathering dust, a relic of a rider who had long since moved on. It was a tomb for memories. Rosa stood in the center of the room, her breathing shallow. She looked around with wide, haunted eyes. This was where her father had come to hide, to plan, to escape the world that eventually caught him. He sat there, she whispered, looking at a broken chair near the empty hearth. "He used to smoke a pipe. I can almost smell the tobacco. We don't have long." "Rosa," Eli said gently, taking up a position by the door. He kept his body in the shadow, his eyes trained on the slice of bright desert visible through the frame. "Search. I will watch the horizon." Rosa nodded, shaking off the ghosts. She moved to the back of the room, where a low bunk frame still clung to the wall. The mattress was long gone, eaten by mice, leaving only the wooden slats. She dropped to her knees, ignoring the sharp rocks digging into her legs. Her hands swept through the debris, clearing away layers of sand and rat nesting. "He told me it was under the sleeping place," she muttered to herself. Under the wood were the headrests. She pried at the floorboards. The wood was warped and swollen with age. She groaned with effort, her fingers slipping, a splinter driving into her thumb. She didn't stop. She dug her nails into the gap and pulled, the sinews in her neck standing out. With a sharp crack, the board gave way. Beneath it, nestled in a hollow scraped out of the hard-packed earth, was a tin box. It was rusted shut, the metal pitted and orange, but it was there. "Eli," she gasped. Eli glanced back for a second, seeing her pull the box from the earth like a pulled tooth, before turning his gaze back to the desert. "Open it," he commanded. Rosa used the butt of her pistol to hammer the latch. The rust held for a moment, then shattered. She pried the lid open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had grown brittle and sticky, was a stack of papers and a thick, leather-bound ledger. Rosa's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the bundle. She peeled back the oilcloth. The smell of old paper and ink rose up, a scent of bureaucracy and secrets. She opened the ledger, her father's handwriting, cramped and careful, filled the pages, columns of numbers, dates, names. "It is here," she whispered, her voice trembling. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the entries. "September, 1882, she read aloud. "Payment from C. Harlow, $500, for the disruption of the Circle K drive." She turned the page. "October, payment from C. Harlow, $1,000, for the acquisition of the water rights at Coyote Creek." She stopped at a page marked with a heavy ink stain. The date was 3 years ago, the week before the fire. "Payment for diversion." She read, tears welling in her eyes. $2,000. Harlow paid for the men. He paid for the kerosene. She reached into the box and pulled out a bundle of letters. She unfolded one. It was written on fine stationery, the kind imported from St. Louis, the header embossed with the brand of the Harlow Ranch. "Valdez." The letter read in a sprawling, arrogant script. "The town needs a scare. I need the bank cleared out before the auditors arrive from Tucson. Burn the livery. Make it loud. I will handle the marshal. Do this, and the valley is yours to run." Rosa sank back on her heels, the letter clutching in her hand. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, ugly sound of vindication mixed with a crushing grief. "He knew," she said, her voice breaking. "My father knew. He wasn't just a thief, Eli. He was a hired gun for the man who calls himself a king." She looked up at Eli, tears streaming down her dusty face. "They called him a monster," she said, "but he was just a tool. And Harlow killed those children. He ordered the fire that took them." Eli left his post at the door and crossed the room in 3 long strides. He knelt beside her, his hand heavy and warm on her shoulder. "We have him," Eli said, his voice low and fierce. "This is the rope, Rosa. This hangs him." Rosa leaned into him, pressing her forehead against his arm. She was shaking violently. "It doesn't bring them back," she whispered. "The children, my father, it is just paper. Eli." "It is the truth," Eli said. "And the truth is the only thing that cleans the wound." He helped her stand, steadying her as she swayed. He took the ledger and the letters and wrapped them carefully in the oilcloth, tucking the bundle inside his shirt, against his skin. "We need to go," Eli said. "Now that we have it, we are in more danger than before. If Harlow knows this exists, he will burn the whole territory to find us." He moved back to the door to check the horizon one last time before they made their run. He froze. In the distance, miles out but closing fast, a plume of dust rose against the blue sky. It wasn't the erratic dust of a wind devil. It was the steady, driving dust of riders moving with purpose. "Damn it!" Eli hissed. "What is it?" Rosa asked, stepping up beside him. "Riders," Eli said. 6, maybe 7. They are on our trail." "How did they find us?" Rosa asked, fear spiking in her voice. "They didn't have to find us," Eli said grimly. "They just had to know where Juan Valdez hid his secrets. Harlow has men who remember." He grabbed her arm. "We can't go out the front. They will see us before we make the saddle. Is there a back way out of this rocks?" Rosa nodded frantically. "There is an arroyo behind the compound. It is steep, a washout. It leads down into the Badlands." "Get the horse," Eli ordered. They scrambled out of the adobe ruins, dragging the tired sorrel with them. The heat hit them like a hammer as they emerged from the shade. They skirted the back wall, sliding down a bank of loose shale into a narrow, twisting cut in the earth. The arroyo was a nightmare of crumbling rock and thorny brush. It was too steep to ride. Eli took the reins, leading the horse, while Rosa followed, stumbling in the loose footing. They had made it perhaps a quarter of a mile when the first crack of a rifle echoed off the canyon walls. Ping! A bullet struck the rock face 3 feet above Eli's head, spraying stone chips into his face. The sound of the shot rolled over them a second later. A dull boom. "They saw us!" Eli shouted. "Move!" He slapped the horse's rump, urging the animal forward. The sorrel scrambled, hooves striking sparks on the flinty ground. More shots rang out, a ragged volley. The pursuers were on the ridge above the hideout, firing down into the cut. Bullets kicked up spurts of sand around their feet. "Keep your head down," Eli yelled, grabbing Rosa and shoving her ahead of him. They ran, lungs burning, the air shimmering with heat and violence. The arroyo twisted, offering momentary cover, then opened up again, exposing them to the fire from above. Eli turned to check the ridge. He saw a silhouette, a man with a rifle, outlined against the sun. He drew his revolver and fired a snapshot, more to keep their heads down than to hit anything at that range. As he turned back, a hammer blow struck his upper arm. The impact spun him around. He stumbled, dropping to one knee. A spray of red mist painted the dry rocks. "Eli!" Rosa screamed. She scrambled back to him, her hands grabbing his shirt. "I am fine," he gritted out, his face going gray with shock. "Just a graze. Keep moving." He tried to stand, but the arm hung useless at his side, blood soaking the sleeve of his shirt and dripping onto the sand. The bullet had torn through the muscle of his bicep. Rosa looked at the blood, then at the ridge where the dust of the riders was getting closer. "Get on the horse," she commanded. grabbing the reins. "No!" Eli gasped, staggering to his feet. "He can't carry double in this sand. You ride, I will hold them off." "I am not leaving you," Rosa yelled, her voice cracking with fury and terror. "You think I will ride away and let you die for me? Get on the horse, Eli Carter, or I will shoot you myself and drag you." Eli looked at her. Her eyes were wild, blazing with a ferocity that matched the sun. She was not the frightened victim he had pulled from the bushes days ago. She was a woman fighting for her life. And for his, he didn't argue. He couldn't. He grabbed the saddle horn with his good hand and hauled himself up, gritting his teeth against the wave of nausea that rolled over him. Rosa slapped the horse into a run, running alongside, holding onto the stirrup leather. They scrambled down the wash, sliding and stumbling, until the walls of the canyon rose high enough to block the line of sight from the ridge. The gunfire ceased, replaced by the sound of shouting and the clatter of hooves on rock as the posse tried to find a way down to follow them. They didn't stop. They moved until the sun began to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the badlands. The horse was blowing hard, foam lathering its neck. Rosa was stumbling with every step, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They collapsed in the shelter of a narrow slot canyon, miles from the hideout but still deep in the killing ground. Eli slid from the saddle, his legs buckling. Rosa caught him, lowering him to the sand. "Let me see," she panted, tearing the sleeve of his shirt. The wound was ugly, a deep furrow through the meat of the arm. It was bleeding sluggishly now, but he had lost a lot of blood. Rosa worked with frantic efficiency. She used the last of their water to wash the grit from the wound. She tore strips from her own petticoat to bind it tight. Eli watched her through half-closed eyes. The pain was a dull throb, a constant companion. "We can't outrun them," Eli whispered, his voice dry. "I know," Rosa said, tying the knot tight. She sat back, wiping sweat and blood from her forehead. "They have fresh horses. We have one tired gelding and a canteen of air." Eli looked up at the strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. It was turning a deep, indigo blue. The first stars were appearing, indifferent and cold. "If we stay out here, they will run us down by noon tomorrow," Eli said. "Or the thirst will finish us." "What do we do?" Rosa asked. Her voice was small, stripped of the adrenaline that had carried her this far. "We go to redemption," Eli said. Rosa froze. She stared at him as if he had suggested they shoot themselves. "Redemption," she repeated. "You want to ride back to the place that wants to hang me? To the marshal? To Harlow?" "It is the only play we have left," Eli said, struggling to sit up. "Out here, they can kill us and bury us, and no one will ever know. The ledger, the letters, they disappear with us." He locked eyes with her. "But if we ride into town, if we ride in at high noon, right down Main Street, they can't shoot us in cold blood, not with the whole town watching. Not if we have the proof in our hands." "It is suicide," Rosa whispered. "They will arrest us before we say a word." "Maybe," Eli said. "But it forces them to do it in the light. Shadows are where Harlow lives." "Rosa, we have to drag him into the sun." Rosa looked away, staring at the canyon wall. The fear was a cold stone in her stomach. Redemption. The name tasted like ash. She saw the faces of the townspeople, the sneers, the turned backs, the way they had looked at her like she was something dirty. She saw the children pulling away. She saw the smoke rising from the livery. To go back there was to walk naked into a pit of vipers. But then she looked at Eli. He was pale, his lips cracked, his shirt stained with the blood he had spilled for her. He was dying, inch by inch, because he had chosen to help her. She couldn't let him die in the dirt of a nameless canyon. "Okay," she said softly. "We go to redemption." They camped that night in the silence of the slot canyon. They didn't light a fire. The risk was too great. They huddled together against the rock, sharing the last of the jerky, chewing slowly to make it last. The air grew cold, but it was a different kind of cold than the high country. It was a dry, still chill that settled in the bones. Rosa checked Eli's bandage. The bleeding had stopped, but his skin was hot to the touch. "I am sorry," she said into the darkness. For what? Eli asked, his voice rough. For this, she said, gesturing to his arm. To the canyon, to the desperate situation. You were just driving horses. Eli, you had a life. Now you are bleeding in a ditch with a wanted woman. You shouldn't have stopped. Eli reached out with his good hand and took hers. His grip was weak, but steady. I told you, Rosa, I made a choice. You deserve better, she said, her voice trembling. You deserve a woman who brings you peace, not a war. You deserve a life that doesn't end with a noose. Eli shifted, wincing as his arm throbbed. He pulled her closer until her head rested on his uninjured shoulder. Love isn't a wage you earn, Rosa, he said quietly. It isn't about what you deserve. It is about who you choose to ride the river with. He turned his head, pressing his lips to her hair. I lived 10 years trying to be safe, he said, trying to make up for a mistake I couldn't fix. It was a long, cold time, these last few days. Even with the bullets, even with the blood, I have felt more alive than I have in a decade. Rosa let out a shuddering breath. Tears leaked from her eyes, hot tracks on her cold skin. She turned her face into his neck, breathing him in, the dust, the sweat, the iron scent of blood. She kissed the pulse point at his throat. Eli, she whispered. She moved carefully, mindful of his wound, but driven by a need to be as close as two people could be. The intimacy that night was not frantic like it had been in the cave. It was slower, softer, tinged with the heavy sorrow of a goodbye that hadn't been spoken yet. They held each other with a desperate tenderness. Rosa traced the line of his jaw, the shape of his ear, memorizing him with her fingertips. Eli held her as if she were made of glass, his good hand stroking her back, soothing the tremors that ran through her. There was no urgency to reach a destination. The act itself was the destination. It was a claiming, a silent vow made in the face of the encroaching dark. If we die tomorrow, Rosa whispered against his lips, I want you to know, you are the only good thing that ever happened to me. We aren't going to die. Eli lied softly, kissing her, but they both knew the odds. They lay together as the constellations wheeled overhead, indifferent ancient lights looking down on two small sparks in the vast blackness. The physical closeness became a wordless promise. If this is all the time they have, they won't waste a heartbeat. They clung to each other, building a fortress out of skin and breath, strong enough to hold back the dawn for just a few more hours. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the eastern rim of the valley when Eli Carter and Rosa Valdez rode into redemption. The light was thin and watery, failing to offer any warmth against the dawn chill. But it cast long, sharp shadows that stretched ahead of them like accusing fingers. The sorrel gelding was stumbling now, his head low, hooves striking the hard-packed dirt of the main street with a hollow, rhythmic clatter that echoed off the false-fronted buildings. The town was waking up. The smell of wood smoke and frying bacon hung in the still air. A domestic comfort that felt alien to the two riders who were caked in the dust of the Badlands and dried blood. They did not ride in with guns blazing or horses galloping. They rode in at a walk, a slow, funereal pace that commanded attention more effectively than a shout. A woman sweeping the boardwalk in front of the dry goods store froze, her broom suspended in mid-air. She stared, her mouth falling open as she recognized the dark hair and the set jaw of the woman riding behind the cowboy. It was the Valdez girl, the one the stories said was a demon. Across the street, the bat-wing doors of the saloon pushed open. Two men stumbled out, blinking against the light, their laughter dying in their throats as they saw the pair. A boy rolling a hoop near the livery stable stopped and stared wide-eyed, sensing the sudden, suffocating tension that had descended on the street. Eli kept his eyes forward, scanning the porches and the rooftops. He could feel Rosa trembling against his back, her arms wrapped so tight around his ribs that he could hardly breathe. Steady, he murmured, his voice a low rasp. Keep your head up, Rosa. Let them look. They reached the center of town, stopping in front of the hotel. It was the finest building in Redemption, 2 stories of white-painted wood with a wide porch where the important men sat to watch the world go by. As if summoned by the silence, the doors of the hotel opened. Clayton Harlow stepped out. He looked like a king surveying his subjects. He wore a charcoal vest over a crisp white shirt, his boots polished to a shine that reflected the morning sun. He was clean-shaven, smelling of bay rum and money. Beside him, stepping out from the marshal's office next door, was Marshal Jim Thorne, a heavy-set man with a badge that glinted dully on his chest and a shotgun cradled in the crook of his arm. Behind them, 3 deputies fanned out, their hands hovering near their holsters. Harlow stopped at the edge of the porch steps. He looked at the exhausted horse, at the blood-soaked bandage on Eli's arm, and finally at Rosa. His expression shifted from mild annoyance to a predatory satisfaction. "Well now," Harlow said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet street. "It seems the trash has blown back into town." Marshal Thorne racked the slide of his shotgun. "Get down off that horse," he ordered. "You are under arrest, Rosa Valdez, for murder and bank robbery, and you, Cowboy, for aiding a fugitive." Eli didn't look at the marshal. He looked at the townspeople who were gathering on the boardwalks, shopkeepers, ranchers, wives, and laborers. They stood in clusters, whispering, their faces hard with the prejudice they had been fed for 3 years. Eli dismounted slowly. His boots hit the dust with a heavy thud. He winced as the movement pulled at his wounded arm, but he stayed upright. He turned and reached up for Rosa. He didn't grab her like a prisoner. He placed his hands on her waist, his touch gentle and deliberate. Rosa placed her hands on his shoulders and slid down. As her feet touched the ground, Eli didn't step away. He kept his hand on her back, a visible, undeniable gesture of care. A ripple of confusion went through the watchers. This was not how a man handled a monster. This was how a man handled something precious. Eli turned to face the porch, positioning himself slightly in front of Rosa, shielding her with his body. "We are not here to surrender," Eli said. His voice was rough, like 2 stones grinding together, but it was loud enough to be heard by the woman at the dry goods store and the men at the saloon. "We are here to return something you lost." Harlow laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "The only thing I am interested in returning is that girl to a rope," Harlow said. "Deputy, cuff them." "Wait," Eli shouted. He reached into his shirt with his good hand. The deputies flinched, hands dropping to their guns, but Eli didn't draw a weapon. He pulled out the oilcloth bundle. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing the rusted tin box. He popped the latch and pulled out the thick, leather-bound ledger. Harlow's smile vanished. His eyes fixed on the black book, and, for the first time, a flicker of genuine fear crossed his face. "What is that?" Marshal Thorne asked, glancing nervously at Harlow. "This," Eli said, holding the ledger up high so the sun struck the cover, "is the private account book of Juan Valdez." A murmur went through the crowd. The name Valdez was a curse in this town. "He was a thief," someone shouted from the boardwalk. "He was a hired gun," Eli corrected, his voice cutting through the muttering. "Hired by the man standing on that porch." "Lies," Harlow snapped. "Shoot him, Marshal. He is reaching for a weapon. He is holding a book." "Clayton!" a voice rang out. It was Silas Miller, a rancher with a face like weathered leather, standing near the general store. "Let the man speak." Eli nodded at the rancher. "Thank you, Silas," Eli said. He opened the ledger. "October, 1882. Eli read. $500 paid to the Valdez gang. Purpose, disruption of the Circle K cattle drive. He looked at the crowd. Any of you remember why the Circle K went bust that year? Why their herd scattered and they had to sell their land for pennies? He turned a page. January, 1883. $1,000. Purpose, intimidation of the water rights holders at Coyote Creek. Silas Miller stepped off the boardwalk into the street. His face was pale. "I lost my water rights that year," Silas said, his voice shaking. "My boys were shot at. I had to sell out to the Double H. To you, Harlow." Harlow's face was turning a mottled red. "This is nonsense," Harlow shouted. "That man is reading from a bandit's diary. It is a forgery. It is a desperate trick by a guilty woman." Eli pulled out the letters. He held up a piece of fine, cream-colored stationery. "Is your signature a forgery?" "Harlow?" Eli asked. "Because it is on every one of these letters." He unfolded the paper. "This one is dated 3 years ago," Eli said. "The week before the fire, the street went deathly silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Valdez." Eli read. "The town needs a scare. Burn the livery. Make it loud. I will handle the marshal. Do this, and the valley is yours." Rosa stepped out from behind Eli. She was trembling, but her head was high. She looked directly at the people who had hated her. "I was there," she said, her voice clear and haunting. "My father took the money. He lit the fire, but he did it on orders. We were supposed to create a distraction so the bank could be robbed, but the bank was already empty." She pointed a shaking finger at Harlow. "He moved the money the day before," she said. "He used the fire to terrify you. He used the death of your children to tighten his grip on this valley. And he used me to take the blame because I was the easiest target you had." Harlow looked at the crowd. He saw the shift. He saw the doubt hardening into anger in Silas Miller's eyes. He saw the way the woman with the broom was gripping the handle like a weapon. "Marshal," Harlow hissed. "End this, now!" Marshal Thorne looked at the crowd, then at Harlow. He was sweating. "You heard him," Thorne yelled, raising the shotgun. "Drop the book! Everyone down! No one moved!" "Arrest them!" Harlow screamed, his veneer of sophistication cracking. "Kill them!" A young deputy, a boy no older than 20, stepped forward. His gun was drawn, but his hand was shaking. He looked at Rosa, standing there in her dust and blood. And then he looked at the ledger in Eli's hand. I can't," the deputy stammered. "It is his signature. Marshal, I worked at the post office. I know his hand." "Insubordination!" Harlow roared. He grabbed the gun from the holster of the man beside him. "If you cowards won't do it, I will." The moment stretched, tight as a bowstring. And then it snapped. Harlow raised the gun, aiming not at Eli, but at Rosa. "No!" Eli shouted. He threw himself to the right, shoving Rosa hard. She went sprawling into the dust just as the gun cracked. The bullet caught Eli in the side, just above the hip. The impact was brutal. It lifted him off his feet and spun him around. He hit the ground hard, rolling onto his back. His hand clutching his side as blood, bright and arterial, began to soak through his shirt. "Eli!" Rosa screamed. The street exploded into chaos. The marshal fired his shotgun, the blast tearing into the dirt where Eli had been standing a second before. People on the boardwalk screamed and dove for cover behind water troughs and rain barrels. Rosa didn't think. She didn't look for cover. She saw Eli down, his face twisted in agony, and a white-hot rage flooded her veins. She scrambled on her hands and knees through the dust to where Eli's gun had fallen. She grabbed the heavy Colt revolver. It felt huge in her hand, vibrating with the potential for death. She rolled onto her back and brought the gun up, gripping it with both hands to steady the tremors. Harlow's hired gun, a man in a black duster, was taking aim at Eli's prone form to finish him. Rosa fired. The recoil jarred her shoulder, but her aim was true. The hired gun spun away, clutching his shoulder, his weapon clattering to the boardwalk. "She is shooting!" the marshal yelled. "Take her down!" But the deputies were hesitating. They were looking at Silas Miller, who had drawn his own pistol. They were looking at the shopkeeper who had pulled a shotgun from behind his counter. The town was not firing on the outlaws. The town was watching the Baron. Harlow saw the tide turn. He saw the hired gun go down and the rancher stepping forward. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his arrogance. He turned and ran. He scrambled off the porch, clutching the rail, and sprinted down the alleyway between the hotel and the bank, heading toward the livery stable at the end of the street. He still had the gun in his hand, but he wasn't firing. He was fleeing. "Get him!" Silas Miller shouted. "Don't let him get away!" Rosa ignored the shouting. She crawled to Eli. "Eli," she sobbed, pressing her hands over the wound in his side. The blood was hot and slick. It pumped between her fingers with terrifying speed. "Go!" Eli gasped, his face gray. Get him! Finish it! I am not leaving you!" she cried. He grabbed her wrist, his grip weak but insistent. "Don't let him run! Rosa, clear your name!" She looked at him, seeing the fading light in his eyes. She nodded, a jagged motion. She picked up the gun again and scrambled to her feet. She ran down the alley, her boots slipping in the mud and refuse. She burst out onto the back street near the livery. Harlow was there. He had stopped, cornered. But it wasn't a wall that stopped him. Standing in front of the charred remains of the old livery stable, the skeleton of burnt beams that had been left as a memorial, was a woman. It was Mrs. Gable. She was a small woman, wearing a faded calico dress and a black shawl. She was 60 years old, her face a map of grief. She held no gun. She stood with her arms crossed, blocking the path to the corrals where Harlow kept his thoroughbreds. "Move, woman!" Harlow shouted, waving the pistol. "Get out of my way! Mrs." Gable didn't flinch. She looked at the gun. Then she looked at Harlow's face. "You killed my boy," she said. Her voice was not loud, but in the sudden silence of the street, it sounded like a gavel coming down. Harlow faltered. He looked back. Rosa was coming up the street, the gun in her hand. Silas Miller and the other men were coming around the corner. He was trapped between the gun and the ghost. "It was business," Harlow screamed, his voice cracking, high and thin. "It was necessary! The valley was dying! You people, you have no vision! I brought the railroad. I brought the money. I made this town!" He pointed the gun at Mrs. Gable, his hands shaking. "A few squalid lives? That is the price of progress. I did what had to be done to save you from your own poverty." The confession hung in the air, ugly and naked. He hadn't denied it. He had justified it. "Mrs." Gable took a step forward. "My son was 6 years old. She said—" Harlow snarled and raised the hammer of the gun. "I will kill you too, you old hag. I will." The crack of a rifle shot cut the air. It was sharp and final. Harlow jerked. A small red hole appeared in the center of his chest, ruining the fine fabric of his white shirt. He looked down at it, an expression of utter baffle on his face. He looked at Mrs. Gable, then at Rosa. He opened his mouth to speak, but only blood came out. He collapsed backward, falling into the dust in the shadow of the burnt livery stable. Rosa turned. Standing on the roof of the general store was the young deputy, the one who had refused to shoot earlier. He lowered his rifle, smoke drifting from the barrel. Marshal Thorne, standing near the alley, dropped his shotgun. He raised his hands slowly, his face sagging with the realization that his protection was dead in the dirt. Silas Miller walked up to the marshal. He didn't say a word. He just took the badge off Thorne's chest and pistol whipped him across the jaw. Thorne went down like a sack of grain. It was over. The silence rushed back in, deafening and heavy. Rosa didn't look at the body of the man who had ruined her life. She dropped the gun. It fell into the dust with a heavy thud. Eli. The name tore from her throat. She turned and ran back toward the hotel, pushing through the crowd of stunned townsfolk. They parted for her now, stepping back not with fear, but with a sudden, shamed respect. Eli was lying where he had fallen. A pool of dark blood had spread around him, turning the dust to mud. His eyes were closed, his skin the color of old paper. "No," Rosa moaned. "No, no, no." She dropped to her knees, heedless of the blood that soaked into her dress. She lifted his head into her lap. "Eli," she begged, "open your eyes. Please, you promised. You said you weren't going anywhere." Eli's eyelids fluttered. They opened a fraction. The gray irises were cloudy, unfocused. "Rosa," he whispered. The sound was a bubble of blood on his lips. "I am here," she sobbed, brushing the hair back from his damp forehead. "I am here. We did it. Eli, he is dead. It is over. Did they see?" Eli rasped. "They saw," she said, tears dripping onto his face. "They know the truth. You cleared my name. Eli, you did it. Good." He breathed. "That is good." His head rolled slightly to the side. His breathing was shallow, a wet, rattling sound in his chest. "Stay with me," Rosa pleaded, clutching his shirt. "Don't you dare leave me now." We have a place to go, remember? Where the wind doesn't blow. You promised. Eli tried to smile. It was a ghost of expression. Still, blowing, he whispered. His eyes drifted shut. His chest hitched, then settled into a terrifying stillness. Eli! Rosa screamed. She pulled him up against her chest, rocking him, burying her face in his neck. She screamed his name again and again, a raw, animal sound of grief that echoed off the storefronts and silenced the town. Around her, the people of Redemption stood watching. Mrs. Gable walked up slowly. She stopped a few feet away, looking down at the outlaw woman holding the dying cowboy. The prejudice, the fear, the hatred, it all seemed small and petty in the face of such absolute devastation. Rosa didn't care about them. She didn't care about the law or the ledger or the vindication. She only cared about the fading warmth of the man in her arms. She held him tight, as if she could physically press her own life into his body, begging the universe for one more miracle in a land that rarely granted them. They carried him on a door torn from its hinges. It was a chaotic, desperate procession that moved from the dusty street into the cramped confines of Dr. Josiah Black's office. The room smelled of iodine, stale tobacco, and the metallic tang of dried blood. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that cut through the drawn blinds, indifferent to the life hanging in the balance on the narrow examination table. Rosa walked beside the makeshift stretcher, her hand refusing to let go of Eli's. Her fingers were wrapped so tightly around his that her knuckles were white, straining against the skin. Her face was a mask of tragedy, streaked with the grime of the Badlands and the tears she could no longer hold back. She did not see the townsfolk watching her. She saw only the gray pallor of Eli's face and the terrifying shallowness of his breathing. "Get him on the table, Doctor," Black ordered, stripping off his coat and rolling up his sleeves. He was a man of few words, his face etched with the weary pragmatism of a frontier surgeon. They lifted Eli, his body limp and heavy. A groan escaped his lips, a sound of deep, unconscious pain that tore at Rosa's heart. "You need to step outside, miss," the doctor said, turning to wash his hands in a basin of water. "No," Rosa said. Her voice was brittle but unyielding. "I am not leaving him. Doctor—" Black looked at her. He saw the blood on her dress, the wildness in her eyes, and the gun she still had tucked into her belt. He didn't argue. "Stand out of the light then," he said, "and keep him still." The next few hours were a blur of agony and prayer. The doctor worked with a grim focus, sweat beading on his forehead and dripping onto his nose. He probed the wound with metal instruments, digging for the lead that had torn through muscle and grazed bone. Every time Eli flinched, Rosa whispered to him, a stream of nonsensical promises and desperate pleas. "Please," she murmured, smoothing the damp hair from his forehead. "You are too stubborn to die. Eli Carter, you survived the war, you survived the desert. Do not let a rich man's bullet take you now." Finally, the metallic clink of a bullet dropping into a tin pan signaled the end. The doctor began to stitch the wound, his hands moving with practiced speed. "He is lucky, Doctor," Black said quietly. Tying off the last knot, it missed the gut, took a chunk of his hip and lost a lot of blood, but the vitals are intact. "Will he live?" Rosa asked, her voice trembling. The doctor wiped his hands on a rag. "Men have died from less and lived through worse," he said. "He is strong, and he seems to have a reason to stay. That counts for a lot." Eli didn't wake. He drifted in a fevered sleep, his body fighting the shock. Rosa sat in a hard wooden chair beside the bed, her vigil unbroken. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the room grew dark, lit only by a single kerosene lamp that cast long, wavering shadows against the walls. Through the thin partition that separated the office from the street, Rosa could hear the town. The silence of the afternoon had given way to a low, buzzing murmur. It was the sound of a community trying to rewrite its own history. She heard voices drifting in from the boardwalk. "I never thought I would see the day." A man's voice said, "Harlow, a murderer." And the girl, another voice answered, sounding uncertain, "We chased her like a dog for 3 years. She shot that hired gun dead. The first man said, "Save the cowboy. Maybe we had it wrong. Bill, maybe we were just looking where Harlow pointed." The words were not an apology. They were awkward. Stumbling attempts to reconcile the monster they had invented with the woman they had seen in the street. But they were no longer filled with pure hatred. The venom had been drawn out. The door to the office creaked open. Rosa stiffened, her hand drifting instinctively to her belt. But it was not a threat. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway. The older woman looked smaller without the anger that had fueled her confrontation with Harlow. She clutched her shawl tight around her shoulders. She looked at Eli's sleeping form, then at Rosa. "May I come in?" she asked softly. Rosa nodded, unable to speak. "Mrs." Gable walked into the room. She didn't come to the bedside. She stood a few feet away, her hands twisting the fabric of her shawl. "He is a brave man, Mrs." Gable said, nodding toward Eli. "He is," Rosa whispered. There was a silence, heavy with 3 years of grief and accusation. "Mrs." Gable took a breath, a shuddering intake of air. "I blamed you," she said. "For a long time. I woke up every morning and I cursed your name. I needed a face for my anger. Rosa, and yours was the one they gave me." Rosa looked down at her hands. "I know. I saw you today." "Mrs." Gable continued. "I saw you step out in front of that gun, and I saw you shoot the man who was trying to kill this cowboy. A woman who burns children doesn't fight like that." She took a step closer. "I cannot say I forgive you," she said, her voice trembling. "My boy is still dead, and you were there that night, but I know now that you were not the one holding the match, and I know you tried to stop it today. That matters. It was not a full absolution. It was a fragile, halting peace, but it was enough." "Thank you," Rosa said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Mrs." Gable nodded once, sharp and quick, and turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "I will bring some soup tomorrow. For him, and for you. You look like you haven't eaten in a week." She closed the door, leaving Rosa alone with the man who had made this redemption possible. Days passed. The wind continued to scour the streets of redemption, kicking up dust that rattled against the window panes. The landscape outside remained harsh and unyielding, the mesas standing silent guard over the valley, indifferent to the human drama playing out in their shadow. Eli fought his way back slowly. The fever broke on the 3rd night, leaving him weak and thirsty. On the morning of the 4th day, he opened his eyes. He was disoriented at first. The ceiling was unfamiliar. The smell was sharp and medicinal. Then he felt the weight on his hand. He turned his head. Rosa was asleep in the chair, her head resting on the mattress near his hip. Her fingers were entwined with his, a tangle of warmth and contact. He tried to squeeze her hand, but his grip was weak. The movement was enough, though. Rosa started, her head snapping up. Her eyes were swollen from crying, dark circles bruising the skin beneath them. But when she saw him looking at her, a light kindled in them that was brighter than the morning sun. "Eli," she breathed. She scrambled up, leaning over him, her hands hovering as if afraid to touch him and break the spell. "You are awake." Eli tried to speak. His throat felt like it was full of sand. He swallowed and tried again. "I am not dead then," he rasped, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Rosa let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She pressed her forehead to his hand, her shoulders shaking. "No," she said fiercely. "You are not dead. You are here." Eli looked at her. He lifted his hand, trembling, and brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "And you?" he asked. "I am here too." She said. "What happened?" Eli asked. "Harlow, dead." Rosa said, "Mrs." Gable stopped him. Then the deputy shot him. "It is over." "Eli, the marshal is in irons. They are taking him to Tucson, the town." "They have the ledger. They know." Eli let out a long breath, his body sinking into the mattress. The tension that had held him together for miles, the drive to protect her, finally released its grip. "Good," he whispered. "Good." Their reunion was quiet. There were no grand speeches, no swelling music. There was only the rough chuckle from Eli when he tried to shift his leg and realized how stiff he was, and the way Rosa held a cup of water to his lips, her eyes tracing every line of his face as if memorizing a map home. It took a week before Eli was strong enough to sit up on the side of the bed. The wound was healing clean, leaving a jagged, angry scar that would ache when the rain came. But the muscle would knit. Rosa sat beside him, watching the dust motes dance in the light. She was quiet, her mood contemplative. "What is it?" Eli asked, sensing the shadow that still hung over her. Rosa looked out the window at the dusty main street. "The truth is out," she said softly. "But the truth doesn't change the past. I walk down the street to get water, and people tip their hats now. But their eyes, they are still wary. I am still the Valdez girl. I am still the half-breed who brought violence to their door." She turned to him. "I will always be half welcome here. At best, they will tolerate me because I was right, not because they accept me." She looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her skirt. "Do you regret it, Eli?" she asked suddenly. "Regret what?" he asked. "Lifting me onto your horse," she said. "That first day. Look at you. You have a hole in your side. You almost died. You are stuck in a town that doesn't know what to do with us. If you had ridden past, you would be halfway to California by now. Safe." Eli reached out and took her hand, stopping her nervous fidgeting. "I was halfway to nowhere before I met you, Rosa," he said. His voice was still rough, but clear. "I was drifting, just moving from one job to another, trying to outrun a ghost." He looked her in the eye. "Helping you didn't ruin my life. It gave it direction again." "But the pain," she whispered. "Pain is part of the toll," Eli said. "Loving someone. It scares me. Rosa, I won't lie. It means caring too much in a world that takes everything. It means I have something to lose again. But I would rather have a short, honest love with you than a long, empty life riding fences alone." Rosa squeezed his hand, her throat tight. "So what do we do?" she asked. "Do we leave? We could go north, Montana, or west, somewhere no one knows the name Valdez." Eli considered it. He looked at the map of scars on his own hands, then out at the harsh, beautiful valley that stretched beyond the glass. "We could run," he said. "Start fresh." Rosa looked out the window. She saw the distant hills, purple and red against the sky. She saw the dry riverbed where she had hidden. She saw the town of redemption, battered and ugly and resilient. "This land tried to kill us," she said, "but it is the only home I have ever known. My mother is buried in that cemetery. My father rode these hills." She turned back to Eli, a new resolve hardening her expression. "If we run, it feels like letting them win." She said, "It feels like admitting we don't belong. Then we don't run." Eli said simply, "We stay. We make them look us in the eye every day until they get used to it." The opportunity came 3 days later. A town meeting was held in the church. Eli, leaning heavily on a cane, walked in with Rosa by his side. The room went quiet when they entered, but no one asked them to leave. Silas Miller stood at the pulpit. He spoke of rebuilding. He spoke of the money Harlow had stolen and how they were petitioning the territory to recover it. Then he addressed the elephant in the room. "We owe a debt," Miller said, looking at Eli and Rosa. "A debt of truth, if nothing else." He cleared his throat. "There is a parcel of land on the North Rise. It was seized by Harlow 3 years ago. It has a shack on it, a well that needs digging out. It is rocky ground, hard to work, but it sits on the edge. Not fully in town, but not fully out of it." He paused. "We think maybe it is time someone lived there who knows how to fight for hard ground. It was an offer. It was not charity. The land was poor and the work would be brutal. But it was an acknowledgement. It was a compromise. It said, 'We are not ready to embrace you fully, but we are willing to let you stake a claim.'" Eli looked at Rosa. She nodded. "We will take it," Eli said. In the weeks that followed, they moved into the weather-beaten shack on the rise. It was a humble beginning. The wind blew through the gaps in the walls, and the scrub grass bent low under the constant assault of the elements. They worked side by side. Eli, his limp slowly fading, repaired the fences and patched the roof. Rosa dug out the well, hauling buckets of mud until the water ran clear. They planted a small garden, shielding the green shoots from the wind with stones. Their intimate life became part of this rebuilding. In the evenings, when the work was done and the kerosene lamp burned low, the cabin became a sanctuary. They found each other with a mix of tenderness and hunger that felt like a secret rebellion. They had both been taught that they were broken, Eli by his guilt, Rosa by her blood. But in the dark, pressed together under the quilt, they were whole. The passion between them hadn't faded with the danger. If anything, surviving had made it deeper. It was deliberate. Each touch was a vow, a physical affirmation that they were alive and that they belonged to each other. There were scars, inside and out. Eli would sometimes wake with a start, reaching for a gun that wasn't there. Rosa would sometimes freeze when she saw dust on the horizon, but they pulled each other back. Over time, the ice began to thaw. It started small, a farmer dropping off a bag of seed corn, the blacksmith fixing a hinge for free, awkward, mumbled greetings in the street. Children were the first to truly bridge the gap. They would sneak up the rise to peek at the outlaw woman and the scarred cowboy. They didn't see monsters. They saw two people who worked hard, who laughed softly together when the day was done, and who leaned into each other as if they were the only two trees standing in a gale. The story closes on a late afternoon in autumn. The sky was glowing copper and pink, the light soft and forgiving. Eli and Rosa stood at the edge of their land, near the repaired fence line. They looked down at the town of Redemption, with its smoking chimneys and dusty streets, and then out toward the distant mesas that cut the horizon. The wind tugged at Rosa's hair, blowing strands across her face. She leaned back against Eli's chest, his arms coming around to wrap her in a familiar, protective embrace. She could feel the solid thump of his heart against her back. She rested her hands over his. "It is a hard life." "Eli," she murmured, looking at the rocky soil of their garden. "It is," he agreed, resting his chin on the top of her head. "Maybe you shouldn't have helped me," she said softly, a trace of the old doubt surfacing. "If you hadn't stopped that day, you wouldn't have that limp. You wouldn't have a town judging you. You would be free." Eli tightened his arms around her. He turned her slowly until she was facing him. He looked down into her dark eyes, seeing the history they shared and the future they were building. He reached up and cupped her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I was never free." "Rosa," he said, his voice low against the sound of the wind. "I was just empty." He leaned in closer. "I would lift you onto my horse every time," he whispered. "No matter how many lives I had to live, no matter how much blood, I would do it again today." Rosa's eyes shone with sudden tears. She smiled, a true, radiant smile that erased the years of running. She reached up and pulled him down to her. They shared a long, unhurried kiss. It was full of the taste of dust and the memory of dark roads, but it was also full of the fragile, stubborn hope they had planted on this rocky rise. The land around them remained wild and unforgiving. The wind still howled, and the desert still waited to claim the careless. But within the circle of their embrace, something softer and stronger had taken root. It was a love that had learned to bloom even in the hardest soil, a quiet act of defiance against a world that had tried to keep them apart. And as the sun dipped below the mesas, painting the west in fire and gold, they turned back toward their small, lit cabin, ready to face the night together. Thank you for listening to this story of Eli and Rosa. It has been a journey through the dust and the danger, and I hope you felt every mile of it. I would love to hear where you are listening from, whether you are watching the sunset in Arizona or listening to the rain in London. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this tale of the Wild West, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. We have many more stories to tell, and we would be honored to have you ride along with us. Share your thoughts on the story in the comments. Did Eli make the right choice? Would you have stayed in redemption? Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.